All right, so today we're going to be talking about late 19th century intellectual history. We've already hit the middle of the century, but now we're going to hit the late because there's a pretty big vibe shift that happens around the last few decades of the 19th century, and we'll talk about what that was and why it happened. Now, here's the deal. So, we mentioned that the middle of the 19th century was probably characterized by this continued belief in science and reason and progress, kind of a continuation of the Enlightenment. We call this positivism, as you remember. Now, by the late 19th century, most Europeans continue to value reason and science and progress. But some people are going to start to depart from that, and they're going to start to say, you know what, human beings don't seem to be that rational. They seem to be motivated by petty prejudices and greed and violence and anger. And I'm going to argue a lot of that has to do with kind of the political context at the end of the 19th century. So we've talked about, we know nationalism is on the rise, militarism is on the rise, people are starting to get more aggressive, more angry, and that's going to be reflected in the political sphere. This is going to be influenced by it's going to be influenced by one factor and then lead to another factor. So we're going to talk about two of these things that seem to indicate that people are perhaps less rational than we thought they were. And those are the growth of mass politics and the rise of anti-Semitism. So we'll talk about both of those separately and then explain how they're related to one another. And again, as a result of this, a lot of thinkers and artists during this time period are going to start to get really interested in human psychology and unconscious or irrational motivations for behavior. There's also just kind of a general dark mood at the end of the 19th century. People can predict that World War I is coming, even if they don't name it as such, but they have this sense that something is wrong. Something is about to go really, really badly. And so as a result, just art tends to get really, really dark during this time period. And there's this overall sense of dread and alienation from society. There's a sense that things are changing really rapidly and that is not necessarily a positive thing. We'll explain why that is. We call this general time period in art and literature modernism. And essentially what modernism is, it's all about challenging old ways of thinking, old ways of making art. And again, is just really motivated by the sense that old ways cannot hang on anymore. And there's going to be some kind of cataclysm that destroys everything. This time period, if you look at it, modernism lasts from about the 1890s to the 1950s. So it spans not only kind of the lead up to World War I, but also World War I and World War II, and the rise of all kinds of horrible things as a result of World War II, which we'll get at later in future units. So really pretty broad time period here. And I picked this quote out here, and it's from actually one of our philosophers from this lecture. And I think it communicates this sense of what modernism is all about really, really well. So for many things, the time has come to die out. This new art is a prophet which sees the end approaching for other things than the art, which I think does a really good job of capturing that modernist art wants to destroy or is part of this wave of destruction against old ideals and old beliefs. And then again, it just really captures the sense of kind of doom and cataclysm that honestly makes late 19th century art really fun. All right, but what does this have to do with the broader political context? So we're going to talk about, again, two trends, the rise of mass politics and the rise of anti-Semitism. So we would actually say, when I explain all this, and be like, that actually sounds like a pretty good thing. We'll say, okay, how's it good? How's it bad? In the late 19th century, more and more people are able to access and participate in the political sphere. And part of that has to do with new technology. So one of the reasons why there's more people participating in politics is because of the advent of mass communication and mass media. So we've got telegraphs, we've got telephones, the price of newspapers goes down. So there's more news and more information available than ever before, and more people are able to access it because we've seen governments expand public education, so literacy rates are a lot higher. So there's more people reading about politics, thinking about politics, reading art, reading literature than ever before. Now, we also see, and we've kind of alluded to this a few times during this unit, but in like the second half in the late 19th century, more and more governments are going to not only expand access to media, but expand access to just doing politics itself. So again, we mentioned kind of like this is liberalism's time period. By 1914, so by the time that World War I breaks out, pretty much all of Europe has universal male suffrage, so people can vote. That being said, a lot of kind of old institutions and hierarchies do still remain. So we've still got royal families, we've still got the nobility is still pretty powerful, though of course not as powerful as they once were. And then we've still got the military as a really powerful institution in society. And then of course religion persists as well. And what this does, we have more people participating in the political sphere, but a lot of old hierarchies remain. We have a lot of conflict in society that occurs as a result of this. And what we're going to see is as more and more people get access to the vote, we're also going to see a backlash, and we're going to see a lot of, again, extremist populist politicians exploit people's hatred and fear and prejudice of all these new people who are joining the electorate and starting to participate more in society, and then using that mass media to whip up hatred and prejudice. Now, specifically, one of the big hatreds that really flares up during this time period is anti-Semitism, or prejudice against Jewish people. This is one of the big themes you need to know for AP Euro, and it's also going to help us understand where the Holocaust comes from. So one of my pet peeves about teaching about the Holocaust is people start their teaching about anti-Semitism in the 1930s, but it actually has much, much older roots. Like, anti-Semitism did not just emerge a priori from Hitler's head. It has a long history, and we're going to go through that. We're actually going to go all the way back to the Middle Ages to explain it. Jewish people in Europe has faced discrimination all the way back to the Middle Ages. A lot of this was legal discrimination. Jewish people back during the Middle Ages and during the early modern period, they couldn't live in the same kinds of places as Europeans. They didn't have, or Christian Europeans rather. They didn't have equal access to education. They weren't allowed to own land. And again, in an agricultural society, that means you can't accrue the same kinds of wealth. And they didn't have access to the same kinds of jobs. Now, that being said, this discrimination wasn't really motivated necessarily by racism at this time. Still prejudice, but not specifically racism. Jewish people were still perceived as like a different religion rather than a different race by Christian Europeans. They weren't perceived as like a separate race or ethnicity. It was just a different religion. So you could theoretically convert to Christianity, and that would limit some of the prejudices against you. So in addition, though, to legal discrimination, Jewish people also face a lot of stereotypes and bias. So Christian Europeans stereotype Jewish people as greedy. And again, all of these are stereotypes, so they're not real. If you're wondering where the greedy stereotype came from, this literally came from the fact that Jewish people didn't have any religious prohibitions on charging interest on loans, but Christian Europeans during the Middle Ages and early modern period did, which changed in the early modern period. We know there were lots of Christian and Italian bankers especially, but that stereotype still persisted. Jewish people were also perceived as not being 100% loyal to the countries where they lived. So, for example, Ferdinand and Isabella, we know that they used Catholicism to unite Spain back in the 1400s. And because so much of their identity was based on Catholicism, they accused Jewish people of not being loyal. They could not fundamentally be loyal to the new Spanish state because they weren't Catholic. And again, all false, all stereotypes, all prejudices. But again, this is where it came from. Now, these are all horrible, but the worst of these, the worst stereotype that Jewish people faced during the Middle Ages, was this thing called blood libel. And I'm going to mention it specifically now because it's going to come back in full form later in the 19th century, and it's going to get resurrected. So there was again, false conspiracy theory rumor that Jewish people were responsible for the murder of Christian children as part of their religious practice. And again, medieval stereotype, not real. That being said, we do see a shift in the 1700s and early 1800s. We know that a lot of Europeans, or especially Enlightenment thinkers, valued religious toleration. And so during the 1700s and first half of the 1800s, so first half of the 19th century, a lot of mostly Western European countries, Russia doesn't really lift these, mostly Western European countries start to lift some of this legal restriction and legal discrimination, although the stereotypes still persist. And in fact, during the late 19th century, even though this legal discrimination has decreased in a lot of places, there's actually a rise in stereotypes and prejudice and anti-Semitism. And a lot of this has to do with just the way that Europeans are, as we know, we're seeing increased nationalism, we're seeing increased racism, we're seeing scientific Darwinism, all kinds of racist pseudoscience. So Europeans are just especially prejudiced during this time period. And as we've seen how that motivated new imperialism, it's also going to motivate anti-Semitism back in Europe. And just to illustrate kind of this is part of a common trend, we see something similar happening in the United States as racial minorities, particularly Black people, gain civil rights during the time of the Civil War, so mid-19th century, that is followed by this huge backlash against that, and we see the rise of Jim Crow laws, we see the rise of the KKK, mob violence against minorities in the United States, and we see a really similar thing happening in Europe during this time period, although it's going to be targeted primarily at Jewish people within Europe. Now, what we're going to do is kind of go country by country because anti-Semitism looks a little bit different in a variety of different places in Europe. So Russia actually doesn't lift many of their legal discriminations against Jewish people. And then we also have, of course, stereotypes and bias there as well. One of the biggest kind of turning points for anti-Semitism in Russia was when Tsar Alexander III accused Jewish people of assassinating his father, Alexander II. We know this guy who freed the serfs, right? Again, this was false. It was not a Jewish person who killed Alexander II, but Alexander III was very anti-Semitic and blamed it on them. And again, evoking that stereotype that Jewish people couldn't be loyal to the countries where they live. Violence was worse against Jewish people than really anywhere in Western Europe. We saw these waves of essentially mass murders motivated by anti-Semitism. These were the pogroms. So what you would have is like there would be riots across Russia. There were several waves of them between the 1880s and 1900s, where like mobs would just invade Jewish sections of towns and kill people who lived there and steal, break into their businesses, steal stuff from their homes and things like that. We also see this document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, published in Russia in the late 19th century. We're still not really sure who published it. Is most likely the Russian secret police. We don't know to what extent the Tsar was involved, though there's some suggestion that Alexander III was involved with this. The Tsar was aware. And essentially, what this document did is it again gave new life to old anti-Semitic stereotypes. It perpetuated that myth about blood libel, and accused Jewish people of being kind of secretly controlling other governments in Europe. Again, Jewish people didn't have as much political power, especially not in Russia. So again, completely false stereotype. There's no kind of secret order of Jewish people controlling the government. It was all made up. And what the Tsar, or at least Russian secret police, was trying to do was take some of the heat off the Tsar, who was still pretty unpopular at this time, and try and again turn it against this minority within Europe that had relatively little power. Now, we're also going to see anti-Semitism in Germany and Austria. Specifically, I would say kind of mostly from German nationalists, but especially in the Austrian Empire, you see anti-Semitism from other kinds of nationalists as well, Czech, Hungarian, etc. And again, the rise of anti-Semitism in these places, especially linked with the rise in nationalism. We see this kind of new type of populist nationalist politician emerge in Germany and Austria who uses anti-Semitism to kind of whip up their base and get them out to vote. And two really good examples of this are Karl Lueger, who is the mayor of Vienna in Austria. He used anti-Semitism to get people to vote for him, as well as the politician Adolf Stoker in Germany. We also see kind of a correspondence with anti-immigrant rhetoric. A lot of Jewish people from Russia are going to flee those riots and pogroms and leave for their next door neighbors, the German Empire and the Austrian Empire. So there's also kind of an overlap with anti-immigrant and anti-refugee rhetoric as well in this area. One of the most famous anti-Semitic incidents in late 19th century Europe was actually in France, though, and this was the Dreyfus Affair. There was a French Jewish military officer named Dreyfus. He was convicted of treason, so selling military secrets to the Germans, but his conviction was like a total sham. There was no real evidence against him. It was likely that someone else did this, but it provoked kind of like this anti-Semitic fervor and again kind of resurrected stereotypes that Jewish people weren't loyal. There was a backlash to this in France. There was the writer Émile Zola wrote a public letter condemning the trial called J'accuse, but again, it just kind of fanned the flames of anti-Semitism even further. So all this raises the question, how did Jewish people respond to this? A lot of Jewish people just straight up left Europe. The greatest wave of Jewish immigration from Europe to the United States occurred during this time period. The United States actually put restrictions on Jewish immigration in the 1920s. So even like during the Holocaust, there was not this much immigration of Jewish people to the United States. Some Jewish people are going to say, you know what, like we don't need to go to the United States. Like why don't we go back to our ancestral homeland, wherever that is? And so during this time period, we see the founding of Zionism, which is a belief system which suggests that it's kind of Jewish nationalism, if it helps you to think of that, and actually emerged in the Austrian Empire alongside the emergence of all other kinds of nationalism. The guy who came up with this name is Theodor Herzl, and he advocated that Jewish people should go back to their homeland in the Middle East. This will eventually lead to the founding of the modern state of Israel, but we'll get into that in a future unit. All right, so now let's actually shift to the what intellectuals are thinking about all of this as they're observing this. So they're observing this rise in kind of irrational hatreds and prejudices and militarism and nationalism, and that is going to shape how they think about human nature and human behavior. And the first of these is a guy we're going to talk about, Friedrich Nietzsche, who we've already seen quotes from here and there throughout this course, but now we're actually getting who was he, what did he believe? He is notable for, again, kind of that modernist trend of challenging kind of established ways of thinking. And Nietzsche didn't just critique Christianity, he also critiqued Enlightenment thinking. And we're going to see, again, a really big shift from how people in the Enlightenment understood human behavior to this new kind of modernist time period. Now, Nietzsche is interesting. He was actually a hardcore German nationalist in his youth. He volunteered himself for the Franco-Prussian War, and that ended up causing him to break with German nationalism. His experience was pretty traumatic. So he is watching the rise of the new German Empire. He's watching the rise of anti-Semitism and German nationalism, and this is going to shape how he thinks about human nature. So what does he think about human nature? Well, first of all, he says that human beings are not driven by reason. So again, directly challenging Enlightenment philosophy here. He says human beings are like animals. They are driven by instinct, and specifically, they are driven by a desire for power, which is the will to power. A desire for control over others, over the world, over yourself, and a desire to both create things and destroy things. He does say reason is an important motivator of human behavior, but it's actually kind of a function of the will to power. We want to have power over the world by understanding it. Now, following from this, again, critiquing both Christianity and Enlightenment philosophy, he says, there is no such thing as moral truth. There is nothing that is good forever, for everyone, for all time. Morality is constructed by a society, Christianity included, right? So again, challenging not only Christian understandings of morality, what's good comes from God, but he's also challenging Enlightenment thoughts about morality here, because remember, our Enlightenment philosophers believed that moral truths could be uncovered through reason. Nietzsche says it's all made up. Moreover, and here's where it starts to really get crazy, Nietzsche says that Christian morality, the morality of modern Europe, is directly in conflict with the will to power. He says Christianity values compassion, values caring for others, values service to others. He says not just Christians, but Enlightenment philosophers as well. And he says this runs counter to the will to power. It causes human beings to repress their will to power, which therefore makes them sick and sad and weak. And again, he says this isn't just Christians in Europe, this is all of Europe. Including people who don't necessarily see themselves as especially religious. So again, like our Enlightenment philosophers. So morality all made up, and then the specific kind of morality that Europe is practicing at this time, regardless of whether they're actually religiously practicing, he thinks is bad for humans because it causes them to suppress their will to power. Now, as a result, he says what Europeans need to do is they need to create a new kind of morality, a new kind of moral system, redefine what it means to be good. And he says it's going to be individual. There's nothing, again, can be good for everyone, for everybody. It's what's good for the individual is up to the individual. But Nietzsche says most of us are cowards and we don't have the capacity to do that. So he writes about this concept of the Übermensch, who is this person who is superior and will be capable of breaking free from established morality and creating new kinds of morality and new kinds of art, blah, 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 blah. Now, that being said, you're like, wow, who would this appeal to? Would this appeal to hardcore nationalists who think they're better than everyone else and are creating their own new kinds of moral system that allows them to invade other countries? Yes, it does appeal to nationalists. So after Nietzsche dies, even before he dies, actually, his ideals get taken up both by the Second Reich and then, as I think a lot of people know, the Third Reich as well. So we'll get to that when we get to World War II. All right, but Nietzsche's not the only one who thinks people are motivated by reason. Sigmund Freud is a psychologist who is going to apply some of Nietzsche's ideas to the field of psychology in the field of medicine. He's going to try and prove medically that human beings are not motivated by reason, they're motivated by emotion and by instinct. So the field that Sigmund Freud comes up with is called psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud, by the way, is from Austria, so a little bit south from where Nietzsche was. And psychoanalysis understands human behavior as the product of a struggle between our conscious and unconscious minds, a struggle between our desire for reason and social norms and order, and then our kind of fundamental instinctual desire for, in Freud's case, pleasure. So Nietzsche thinks we all want to fight each other. Freud thinks we want to have fun with each other. So Freud divides up the human mind in three parts: the irrational, pleasure-seeking, instinctual id, the superego, which is our moral conscience and the norms we've absorbed from society. So again, kind of like what Nietzsche's saying about how we have to repress our will to power based on the society that we live in and social norms around goodness and kindness and whatnot. Freud's kind of picking that up as well. And then the third part is our ego, and that kind of has to mediate between our moral conscience that we absorb from society and our irrational id. Freud was also really in dreams. He thought that dreams could be a guide to what is going on in our subconscious that we don't necessarily voice in our day-to-day life. And I also want to kind of contextualize a little bit further. Part of the reason why Freud and Nietzsche are seeing human beings as kind of motivated by instinct and desire, there's also some influence with Darwin here, right? So both Freud and Nietzsche are both saying, hey, human beings, we're just animals. We're not special. We're not magical. We're not higher than any other animal. Just like animals are motivated by instinct, so are human beings. We also see this kind of emphasis on psychology, the subconscious, dreams, instinct, reflected in literature as well. So in literature, realism kind of continues along. We see it especially continue along in Russia, and then we see the development of Russian realism. So authors like Tolstoy and Dostoevsky are similarly going to want to kind of portray people's everyday lives and struggles, but there's more of an emphasis on, again, kind of like the dark side of the human subconscious motivating people's behavior. So for example, there's a book by Dostoevsky called Crime and Punishment about this kind of like Nietzschean Superman type figure named Raskolnikov, who commits a murder, a double murder, and then it explores kind of why he does that and how he breaks with morality and tries to create a new one of his own. And this actually ends up ending badly for him. It's a pretty good book. You can check it out. In the West, we also see the emergence of something called naturalism, which is kind of a descendant of realism, which again is portraying people's everyday lives, but with more of an emphasis on psychology and unconscious drives. And our example here is Émile Zola, who, as you know, wrote J'accuse in response to anti-Semitism as well. In France, we see the emergence of symbolism, and this is mostly a poetic movement. There's some novels as well, which is about sort of conveying people's experiences in life, but mostly through kind of like this dreamlike, distorted lens. It's a lot of kind of like spooky stuff going on, so it's kind of similar to the Gothic literature we saw with Romanticism, but again, kind of this emphasis not on conveying reality really as it is, but conveying people's impression of reality. We also see that theme emerge in the visual arts, and this is partly motivated by technology as well. So we have photography now, so artists don't necessarily need to paint life exactly as it is. They have more of an opportunity to kind of create distortions and abstractions. So a lot of artists during the late 19th century were more concerned with capturing like light and feeling and color, and generally an impression of their environment, not a realistic depiction of it. So there's actually three movements that kind of go one after the other. We have Impressionism, so that's Monet up here. You can see it's not a really realistic depiction of the environment. It's more about light and color and quick brushstrokes. This evolves into Post-Impressionism, which gets even less realistic, more about light and feeling and color. And then finally, Expressionism. And this here is Edvard Munch, and you can see here there's a progression from Impressionism to Post-Impressionism to Expressionism. Art is even more abstract as we go along, and we'll see this come even to further fruition in the 20th century. All right, that's where we're going to end. Thank you for watching.